Men are getting shot. Hunting is a sport in the inner city, and the prey is young men. Same inside as your sons and their friends, and some of the shooters are too, just boys with guns. Here, Larry Strauss shares the reality of inner city crime. Many are just boys with guns. In the status quo, America neglects its role in creating state violence. You must go act to end this. As From 13 writes, Americans don't blame guns, but a subset of the population. They claim it's mostly a matter of thugs killing thugs, but many of these people carry guns to protect themselves. However, if 2 people carry guns, a confrontation ends with 1 dead and the other in prison. Young men do killing each other, do not manufacture their own guns, or even organize the gun trade. Bad guys would not have become bad guys if guns had not been available. And the wide-scale availability of guns currently normalizes death in America. As Carries 08 writes, it is easier for young men to obtain guns than textbooks. Homicide, about 90% by guns, is the leading cause of death for black youth. The introduction of guns has created a disaster in America. And surrounded by gunshots, children are doomed to a cycle of poverty and violence. As Reich 02 writes, children exposed to gun violence experience negative psychological effects. In inner city Philadelphia, 3/4 had heard gunfire and 1/3 had seen someone shot. This was correlated with depression, lower GPA, and more absences from school, and 19% of the children wish they committed suicide. And gun violence also causes inequality in these inner city communities. As Schumann 15 writes, widespread availability of guns a significant cause of inequality. Guns make life less stable for people, and people think of violent crime as a result of poverty, but in fact, violent crime is what causes poverty in the first place. Also, gun violence disproportionately affects black Americans. As the Pew Research Center in 2013 writes, in 2010, there were 11,000 homicides from firearms. However, blacks were 55% of victims, but 13% of the population, which translates out into 6,000 black youth dying each year. Thus, the standard for today's round is breaking the perpetual cycle of gun violence in inner city communities. Currently, in the status quo, most criminals acquire guns from private parties. As Whitmute 13 writes, private party sales are an important contributor to violence. 80% of felons acquire their firearms from private parties. And reducing availability of guns also decreases violence. As Fagan 98 writes, adolescents in cities are carrying guns on a large scale. An increase in gun availability fuels the increase in violence. Reducing availability of guns reduces youth violence. And also more regulation reduces availability of guns. As Foyet 2000 writes, the more widely available guns, the more people murdered. It also affects the price of guns on illicit markets, because when we restrict availability of guns, the supply of guns in secondary or illicit markets decreases, and as a result, their cost increases, which makes it harder for teenagers and youth and overall people to obtain these guns. And raising prices also decreases the amount of guns in circulation. As Douglas 02 writes, demand for guns is elastic, meaning that a 1% increase in price lowers demand by 3%. And the illicit market also relies on a steady supply of guns, which means that we solve the root cause by decreasing supply. Dixon in 1993 writes, by reducing the pool of guns, it reduces the number of guns in the hands of criminals. Illegal guns are dependent on the presence of legally purchased guns in the first place. And overall, the best study ever conducted confirms this, as McDonald in 2016 finds that the largest study ever done found a clear link between regulation and fewer homicides. The team reviewed 130 high-quality studies in 10 countries over 60 years and found that when you restrict access to guns, it reduces the number of deaths. Also, Missouri empirically proves that universal background checks decreases homicides. As Portero in 2013 writes, universal background checks have an enormous impact on reducing deaths. After Missouri repealed universal background checks, the homicide rate spiked by 25%. Also, we decrease the amount of illegal trafficking that goes on in these communities. As Valesky 14 writes, that after controlling for a multitude of factors, states with more expansive background checks had 48% less illegal trafficking and overall fewer deaths. For all these reasons, and because we believe in saving inner cities, we urge you to vote.
We negate. Our sole contention is shell-shocking American politics. Val 16 of Penn State concludes that federal gun laws will result in backlash from the pro-gun community. This happens in 2 ways. First, NRA-driven polarization. The National Rifle Association is America's most powerful lobbying organization. Brasted 14 of Brockport College explains that the NRA is dependent on extreme polarized rhetoric because it requires an enemy to rally its base supporters. While the NRA was previously able to mobilize against the Obama administration, the lack of a clear enemy now will shift blame on gun legislation itself. Just last week, Godiano of USA Today reported that the NRA opposes any policy that expands background checks. Stirpin06 of the Naval Postgraduate School writes that previous losses on gun control legislation have caused the NRA to refocus its efforts into changing the political landscape, trying to reach as many members and gun owners as possible by driving an extreme policy platform to increase polarization. Finley furthers that the NRA manipulates public opinion to push an agenda associated with deregulation in the conservative platform. Moreover, when moderate Republican politicians vote for background checks, the NRA pushes them out of office by supporting challengers in the upcoming election. When the gun lobby loses, it preserves its power and rebounds with an equal and opposite political reaction. Second, an appeal to the base. Even though a majority of Americans support background checks, Spitzer 15 of Cornell University explains that guns rights supporters are much more likely to vote solely on gun issues and are more politically active. This activism gap forces politicians to pander to the passionate minority. Spitzer furthers, elected officials are forced to support the pro-gun positions due to a combination of pressure from constituents and to avoid potentially nasty confrontations with pro-gun supporters. If universal background checks pass, politicians fail their most vocal constituents. They therefore have to appease their base by pushing for other major conservative policies. Horowitz-06 of the University of Maryland confirms that increasing polarization reinforces more ideologically extreme policy by elected representatives. There are two dire consequences. First, destroying the bill. Gurney 13 of the Daily Beast observes that when the NRA recognizes that it is unable to stop a new law requiring universal background checks for gun sales, it will undermine the law by promoting the writing of loopholes to make enforcement of the new policy impossible. Parsons 13 of the Center for American Progress explains that these loopholes jeopardize public safety and undermine any new legislation that Congress may pass to reduce gun violence. For example, previous writers have prevented law enforcement from computerizing their data and frustrated their efforts to regulate gun dealers. Parsons concludes that the NRA will support the bill so long as the enforcer is leaderless, blinded, and shackled. This is devastating in the context of the wider issue of gun violence. Finley concludes policymaking discourse that focuses on blaming specific individuals and conditions downplays the root causes of gun crime, such as the wider economic or social context of violence, and prevents meaningful solutions. Empirically, Beauchamp 13 of Vox magazine reports that gun laws passed following major tragedies were NRA-promoted policies that actually weakened federal firearms laws. Second, increasing unreasonable suspicions. Background checks perpetuate the idea that more people should be excluded from having guns. Gorovich 15 of Brown University explains that gun control measures mean writing more criminal laws, creating new crimes, and therefore creating more criminals or more reasons for police to suspect people of crimes. Unfortunately, this creates more pretexts for militarized and prejudiced policing. Pollock 17 of the University of Chicago contends that the promise of preventing gun crime in general motivates police tactics that have the goal of getting guns off the street. Empirically, Cook 14 of Duke University finds that in jurisdictions that take guns seriously, police have made a practice of stopping people they have reasonable suspicion to believe are engaged in criminal behavior, such as carrying an illegal weapon. This is devastating, as Pollock concludes that more stringent gun policing might increase the flow of convicts into already overpopulated prisons and jails. Thus, we negate.
Can I please have the first question?
Yeah, go ahead.
So, 8 states currently have universal background checks, correct?
About 8,
Okay,
yeah.
so have we seen any increased incarceration in these 8 states?
Increase in incarceration?
Yeah, you claim how universal background checks increases incarceration of minority communities. Have we seen this in these 8 states?
Oh, it's not about increasing incarceration. It's about
You say they go to jail, so have we seen this happening in the South?
Okay, can I explain what I was
go
going to
ahead.
say? Okay, so basically what we're saying is that police have, it creates the pretext for militarized and prejudiced policing, and our real impact here is basically stop and frisk, and we have a card, you can see it if you want, that says when someone stop and frisk, they're I think 1,100% more likely to have unnecessary force used against them. So that's an impact there.
Wait, didn't you say it leads to more minorities going to prison than one
militarized and prejudiced.
Okay, so let's talk about these 8 states.
Oh yeah, that's more stringent gun
policing.
policing,
Have we
yeah.
seen stop and frisk in these 8 states?
Actually, can I get a question, please?
Sure, go ahead.
Okay, so you talk about raising prices,
Yes.
sort of, and then what's your link into that?
When we decrease availability, we increase prices. Like, it's just basic supply and demand. But also, if you want
So gun demand is elastic?
Yes. And it
Even for
also,
criminals?
especially in the illicit market, gun demand is extremely elastic.
Okay, can I see your evidence for that after cross?
Yeah, sure. Like,
Awesome.
if you make those arguments, we'll respond to them. All
I
right.
mean, like, we've got evidence saying it's inelastic, so I figured go ahead and compare.
Sure. Okay. Can I have a question?
Yeah, go ahead.
It's lecture 1 about polarization in the NRA, right?
Yeah.
So the NRA has been opposed to universal background checks for 2 decades, right?
Yep.
Okay, so wouldn't passing background checks in all 50 states tell the NRA that your ideas don't matter? We are going to pass background checks regardless of what
absolutely
happens.
It tells the NRA that their ideas don't matter. Here's
Exactly.
the
Doesn't that
problem.
fracture their narrative, though?
Here's the problem with that. There's some pretty serious backlash that happens. So what we saw recently was like after the Sandy Hook shootings, there was a lot of gun legislation passed, and the NRA gained.
The NRA tried to strike down.
And the NRA gained 100,000 members. You see, in 1993, the last time the federal government passed background checks, the NRA kicked 19 out of 24 politicians that voted for it out of office. That is unprecedented in U.S. history, kicking that number of incumbents out of office.
Just because NRA membership increases, how does that make it more?
So you're saying it fractures the NRA narrative? Clearly it doesn't if their membership is increasing.
That's like, just because more people join the NRA, there's more people in the United States
who
are probably
then fracturing the narrative, why does that matter if more people are joining it?
It tells the NRA that their ideas don't matter when we pass background checks in all 50 states.
Why does it matter if we're telling the NRA their ideas don't matter if they're just getting more powerful?
People will see that the NRA doesn't work.
But they don't see. They actually join more. That's what our empirics tell you. 100,000 just the last time. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, so let's go to your contention 2 about second one about appealing to the base.
Yeah.
So don't the most polarized voters already go vote in the status quo?
You say they don't vote?
Go vote.
Yes.
Okay, so what's the impact of the negative? If we
the
most polarized people, the 8% we don't support already go vote, right?
I understand your question.
Yeah.
So basically what we're saying is that politicians who vote against universal background checks will feel the need to swing back to more extreme conservative policies in order to appease that same base.
Okay, sure.
Okay, and are you ready? Judges, are we all ready? Excellent. Opponents, you ready? Okay. Awesome. As a map for the judges, I'll just be going top down through the opponent's case, just refuting the arguments. Okay, let's address NRA backlash and shell shock. So first, they're going to tell you the NRA needs polarization to work, and they're going to create an enemy, and if the NRA opposes background checks, and this is going to lead to a whole bunch of different things. So first, judges, I would argue there's already a ton of political polarization. Universal background checks are not going to increase that polarization. But 2, overall, judges, you have to realize the NRA is not going to see much support from its members in terms of actually opposing background checks. Yes, I understand the NRA poses backlash when the Obama administration tried to implement gun control. Those measures were far more invasive in terms of an assault weapons ban and high-capacity magazine ban. Universal background checks, overall, even Bloomberg and Watts concur in finding that overall 87% of the National Rifle Association actually, which is the most pro-gun group in the country, actually support universal background checks overall. So meaning even the NRA membership supports this idea. So the NRA is not going to get access to its most valuable tool, which is the members. They can vote on state level laws. So overall, the NRA is just going to fall apart there. Moreover, they say that the NRA has previous losses and is going to refocus and try and vote out moderates. The problem is the NRA is really bad at election spending and really bad at getting people elected. Think progress concludes that overall the impact of NRA endorsements and donations to campaign is actually just non-existent. The NRA doesn't donate nearly enough for campaigns to actually win. They usually only donate 0.2% of one candidate's budget, and moreover, even in the elections where they spend upward of $100,000, the NRA doesn't even win half of the time. And lastly, the NRA claims they have successes in elections in pushing out moderates, like our opponents say. The problem is the NRA only spends on elections that think they can already win. Insofar as that's the case, the NRA is spending on elections that are already going to swing the way the NRA says they will, right? This means the NRA is not actually responsible for the success of getting people elected or pushed out of office. The elections would have already gone that way anyways. Next. Moreover, Think Progress also concludes there's a declining support for NRA and declining gun enthusiasm in the country. Overall, the amount of households that actually own guns in the United States has decreased by 20%, and the author concludes that barring a wholesale return to rural living or boom in hunting, this trend is unlikely to reverse, meaning the NRA is going to continue to lose support in the status quo, even if we have increased gun legislation or background checks. Next year, I'll tell you gun voters are more likely to one-issue vote. One, I would argue, insofar as there's a declining number of NRA members and a declining amount of enthusiasm for guns, there's going to be far less one-issue voters, but 2, they're already going to one-issue vote, this is just a non-unique impact. And 3, a lot of those one-issue voters are also supporters of universal background checks, insofar as 87% of the actual, of the NRA membership actually supports background checks. And next, I'm going to tell you, the Republicans, after, universal background checks get passed, they're just going to support radicals and support, radical policies, and then repeal, or then implement a bunch of conservative policies. The problem is, when we see Republicans appealing to radicals and, the very base of their, of their constituency, like they did with the ACA, trying to repeal the ACA, they still don't get legislation passed, right? Even if Republicans appeal to the base and try to repeal Obamacare, there are Republicans who still vote against them, and the bevy of Democrats also vote against them. So in the end, even if they appeal to the base, they're not going to get things passed, they're not going to vote through more conservative legislation. Next, they tell you like that overall the NRA is going to write in loopholes. The problem is they never tell you how many loopholes the NRA is going to write in. Two, they never tell you why it's unique to their world, right? The NRA could like write in loopholes in either world, and I would say it's better to have universal background checks and have some chance of solving inner-city violence than having no chance at all, right? That's like saying, oh yeah, just because there's going to be some issues with the law, we shouldn't pass it at all, and we shouldn't try to save any lives. And that's just not the case. And so next, they just talk about how like, oh, there's going to be like links to like police suspicion. And the problem is, Judge, they completely dropped Gorovich, which is their direct link into policing because of like more like gun control. And moreover, I would argue that gun ownership and increased availability of guns is actually the pretext for violence. As Professor Stockman in 2015, the overall guns possession is the excuse for police shootings of people, and it's the pretext for violence. Insofar as we would actually reduce the availability of guns and presence of guns, police would no longer be able to justify their violence against inner-city communities. Moreover, judges, now I'm actually going to preempt arguments about illicit markets. They're going to tell you like that overall illicit markets could increase the supply of guns even if we had background checks. The problem is Velocity in 2014 concludes that overall in states with universal background checks you see 48% less gun trafficking, and also Professor Sargent in 2013 concludes that overall only 20% of people who actually go to the black market even get guns, which is a massive decrease in the amount of guns that are bought because people are afraid they're going to get robbed or murdered or caught by an undercover cop on the black market. So it's not nearly as accessible as the legal market, which we would close the loopholes in.
With that in mind, let's start with an extension from Kay's. Congressional intervention via riders would extend beyond the realm of gun policy in order for Republicans to get a political victory from the bill. Wegman 15 of the Daily Signal explains that not only are riders designed to gut the bills they are attached to, but they are also written to enact separate policies that would have little chance of passing on their own. Problematically, Representative Jan Skłosky finds that Republicans have a laundry list of these amendments waiting to be attached to a major bill. At the top of the chopping block is cutting education spending. A proposed rider would cut spending on the arts, teacher training programs, and low-income education funding, totaling $2.5 billion. This is incredibly problematic, as Clark 13 of the University of Melbourne finds in a meta-analysis that just a $500 increase in per-pupil education spending increases student achievement by 15%. You cross-apply this with their inner cities community argument because we're helping more. Then, on their case, a big overview. Michaels 13 writes that for a universal background check to have any degree of success, it would have to have the development of a national gun registry. Problematically, Trumbull in 2013 writes that given the way the record-keeping system works, it would be impossible to create a federal database of gun owners based on background checks records. This is true for three reasons. A, any database is temporary and records must be deleted after 24 hours. B, it would violate multiple federal laws. And C, it's politically infeasible. Politicians won't support it or push through efforts to get it passed. This functions as a double bind on their case. They gain no risk of solvency without a registry, but even if you buy that there is a risk that a registry gets created, this magnifies the link into our NRA argument, as the NRA opposes registries even more staunchly than universal background checks. When they tell you that the NRA supports UBCs, what they don't support is a registry. Second, they read you at the bottom of their case, or in the rebuttal, that gun ownership is the pretext for violence, but then they literally tell you, look at the idea that gun ownership is actually going down in the status quo is solving, we don't need to pass UBCs. Then they tell you they reduce the amount of guns, but making guns more expensive and reducing the amount actually increases crime. Cook of Duke University explains that if the availability of illicit goods decreases due to regulations, the net payoff to theft will increase as these goods are on net more expensive due to renewed scarcity. In the context of guns, a constraining of the supply will A, encourage criminals to obtain guns illegally because of the increase in black market prices like they talk about, and B, will encourage illegal arms suppliers to steal and traffic more arms because of the higher price, turning their entire case against them. But then, specifically on trafficking, price increases will not stop criminals, it will encourage them. The demand for guns by criminals is inelastic. Seidberg of the University of Chicago explains that because criminals are always intent on following through with their crime, their demand for guns is inelastic, meaning that they will continue to purchase guns even if prices increase substantially. Their evidence never says that the demand for criminals is elastic. We call for it, that's not what it says. However, universal background checks would increase the price of legal guns. This is incredibly problematic, because when the price of guns increases, more money gets funneled into the NRA's pockets. Finley of Barry University explains that the NRA receives a commission for every gun that is purchased. Thus, the NRA benefits from higher sales and higher prices as money is funneled right into their political action group, furthering their lobbying efforts. Cross-apply this with his rebuttal. When he tells you that the NRA is not powerful, they uniquely make the NRA more powerful, magnifying all of our polarization impacts. But then, Michael 13 of The Hill writes that 80% of gun crimes 80% of crime guns are already outside of retail distribution channels where universal background checks would apply. When 80% of the problem is not addressed by the legislation they're telling you to pass. Even if the law were enforced perfectly, it would be nearly useless. Then they talk about Missouri with this 48% card. That statistic is incredibly irrelevant, as Missouri had permit-to-purchase laws and other gun laws. There's no way to derive causality. But then on his rebuttal, he tells you that polarization is high, but we tell you that they uniquely increase it. Then they tell you the majority of NRA supports. 3 responses. First, they don't support a gun registry. Second, like Izzy tells you in Crossfire, those who don't support it are single-issue voters. They're more likely to vote on it, which means politicians pander towards them. But then third, you extend Bow from Case that tells you that any new federal gun laws will guarantee backlash by the pro-gun community. Then they tell you that they can't kick people out. The NRA is not powerful. Last time the NRA tried to kick moderate Republicans out of office, they were 80% successful. Then he says that there's declining NRA support, but UBCs uniquely increase this. And then we'll talk about the materialization of riders in the summary.
Okay, can I have a question?
Of course.
Okay, so you told me that we need a registry to be effective, right?
Yeah, that's what Michaels tells you.
Okay, so what about the fact that every state with UBCs doesn't have a registry and they all work?
I mean, they all work is the part we contest, right?
Okay, wait, but where do you tell me though the actual where do you analyze state by state the UBCs?
What we tell you is that when you analyze, you compare the states with and states without analysis, you're never going to be able to derive causality. Different gun cultures, different rates of ownership, different laws. You can never derive causality simply from UBCs.
What about Missouri though, right? Where we tell you in one
What
state
other laws
comparison.
did Missouri pass with universal background checks?
Universal background checks?
Yeah, what do they pass with it?
I don't know, like permit to purchase?
What's the permit to purchase law?
You go through background
You
check
have to go
get a gun?
apply to the federal government to get a permit to purchase any gun. Would you agree that that's a higher standard of gun restrictions than a universal background check?
Possibly.
So how do you derive causality uniquely to UBCs? Because I would contend that when they were doing all of those, that's probably what happened.
Okay, right? After the Missouri study, right? What about the McDonald evidence, which directly tells you in a meta-analysis of 130 studies in 10 different countries, including ours, overall you see a decrease in the availability of guns and gun violence with universal background checks in the largest and best study ever conducted on this topic.
Did you mean to say a decrease?
A decrease in gun violence and
Cool.
availability.
So two things on that. One, we tell you that you can't derive causality from other countries. None of those studies uniquely account UBCs. Okay. But then second, we tell you from Cook that even if you do decrease the amount of guns, that functions as a turn on your case, because when you decrease the price of guns, you incentivize the black. Yeah, when you increase the amount of guns, when you increase the amount of guns and increase the price, you encourage the illicit market to expand more. Yeah. We've been on this for a while, and I'd like to get a question. Yeah. What is the biggest impact in the round? Is it gun violence?
I mean, I don't know. We'll see how it materializes.
Okay.
The cases about gun violence.
So that wasn't really a great question, so let's talk about something else.
Okay.
Would you agree that gun ownership, like you say, are you going to stand by that rates of gun ownership are the pretext or the link into or the keystone of all the violence you're talking about?
A lot of it. So what I'm going to say, though, right, is when you increase the prices, though, regardless of whether or not demand changes, right, people can demand guns, but when the price increases, they can't necessarily afford the gun, right?
Well, okay, I would contend that criminals probably can afford the gun.
Wait. Where do you give me evidence that that's true, right? We tell you directly the price of guns, and you can see this as well. The price of guns massively increases when you have background checks.
That's why we
where do you tell me that they can
because of
afford
the elasticity argument. If I'm a commercial gun buyer,
that's about
$150 increase might deter me from buying a gun. Because I don't necessarily need one or want one. That's elasticity. But for criminals who need to commit their crimes, who are going to do it in either world, they're not going to be deterred by a $100 increase on guns. They're going to commit crime either way.
Question about that,
sure.
Right? So that's about demand, right? Can criminals necessarily meet those new, larger, higher purchase prices?
I would guarantee you they can. Because
where?
Because our Hill evidence indicates that 80% of guns that are flowing through the market right now aren't even on the retail supply chain, meaning they're not even affected by UBCs.
But if I may, that's also about private sellers. That's about private sellers, and that's covered by UBCs.
Okay.
Alright, so the map is going to be first responding to the National Gun Registry stuff that they put out in terms of case, going down the negative case, extending some terms of defense, and then coming back and telling me why you're voting pro in today's round. Alright, is everyone good? Alright. Their National Gun Registry argument falls apart when the states in the status quo who have universal background checks do not have a gun registry, which proves their argument empirically false. Their argument is just false. Now let's go extend a few things that they never respond to. The first is that 87% of NRA members support universal background checks, which means that there will not be backlash. But second of all, we tell you how the NRA success rate is only 50%, which means that at net, it's net zero. But third of all, they say how the NRA pushed 19 people out of Colorado. The problem is those 19 people were already set to win in polls regardless of whether or not the NRA was involved. As a result, the NRA just claims success, but in reality, they donate 0.2% of their funding to these candidates, which is no impact whatsoever. But third of all, they don't even quantify their impact whatsoever. In an affirmative case, we tell you how gun violence kills 11,000 people each year, and 6,000 of them are African Americans teens, which means over a decade, that's 100,000 people who died, which is 10 times as many people who died in Afghanistan and Iraq in the United States. But then on the second argument, they concede a turn, which is that gun availability is what causes police brutality. They never respond to this whatsoever. With that said, let's go back to the pro case. The first reason why we'll be voting for today's round is going to be because we stop gun violence in inner city communities. They drop all of the framework evidence, such as Reich, Schumann, and Pew, who tells you how gun violence in inner city communities locks these cities into a cycle of crime forever and negatively affects children for the rest of their lives. As a result, you must vote affirmative to at least have some risk of solving for this. We tell you how tens of thousands of Americans die each year, which is hundreds of thousands over a decade. We quantify our impacts that our opponents don't. But third of all, let's go remember Whitney, who tells you how 80% of these criminals obtain their guns from private parties in the first place, which means that universal background check solves. Now let's go to the illicit market debate. They've conceded a Valesky evidence, which tells you how trafficking decreases by 48% in states with universal background checks. This is not talking about Missouri. This is a national analysis, and you should prefer it over the one-state example. But second of all, they've also conceded the McDonald evidence, who tells you how overall, in a study of 60 years and 130 studies, when we pass more regulations, overall gun availability decreases and crime decreases, which is the reason why you're going to be voting pro today's round. Thank you.
We're going to wrap up.
It's just going to be going over some stuff he said in summary, extending from David's rebuttal, and the NRA argument. Is everyone ready? Okay. He brings up this 48% card, but remember that this card is looking at states with background checks versus states without. This isn't causal, it's just correlation, so you can't weigh it that heavily this round. They don't control for things like rates of gun ownership, which could be causing this 48%. They also talk about this 134 countries, the best study ever conducted. Here's the problem with that, it's not just about universal background checks, it's about tons of other different types of gun legislation. Now let's extend what David told you in rebuttal. Remember, they actually dropped the fact that for universal background checks to be effective, they have to have a gun registry. They say because states don't have a gun registry, that doesn't mean that they don't have to have one, but remember, we're not actually seeing any causal link between universal background checks and decreased violence in states. That's something they failed to show you throughout the round, so you can extend Michael's through. You also need to extend the Cook term David read you in rebuttal. Remember what our Cyberg evidence tells you, that criminal demand for guns is inelastic. What this means is that you can extend our Cook card telling you that when you make guns scarcer, one, prices go up, which increases the incentive to traffic guns, and two, theft goes up, increasing crime, especially in these inner city areas that they claim to care so much about. Now let's move on to NRA. Group most of their responses together because they're about how the NRA isn't powerful now. So here's what happens. When the US federal government passes gun legislation, in the past and in the future, we see that the NRA gets more powerful. They gain 100,000 members, and after the Brady Act, they re-emerge as a political powerhouse. Our evidence tells you that the NRA is the most powerful lobbying organization in the entire country, and you can't drop that. Now here's a look at why that matters. This is a piece of terminal defense on the case that they did not respond to, the loopholes. What our evidence says is that the NRA will put so many riders, so many loopholes on universal background checks bills that it will make it totally infeasible to enforce. That is zero impact on their side. Now moving on, we're actually getting offense from this as well. They talk about wanting to help adolescents in inner city schools. You're not helping them when you're cutting $2.5 billion of federal spending on education, and this is an impact that they didn't even touch, so you can extend it clean throughout the round. So taking a step back, looking at the impacts we're running. One, our Cook evidence telling you that crime goes up in their world, and also our education, and extend Michael's terminal defense and NRA add-on terminal defense.
All right, can you have a question?
Yeah, go ahead.
All right. Okay, so in your last speech, you talked about a gun registry, right?
Yeah.
So states that have UBCs right now, why don't they have a gun registry?
Because it's politically infeasible, illegal, and physically impossible.
Wait, why is crime increasing and trafficking decreasing?
Okay, it's not. That's
wait. Our study controls for 8 different factors.
Oh my. Okay, so there's
only 8 factors.
8 different factors
Yes.
between Alabama and
Policing,
California.
incarceration, burglaries, guns, unemployment, poverty.
Okay, how about rates of gun ownership, gun culture mindset, attitudes towards guns, like education, poverty, like.
You can't just indict our study. You need to provide.
Why can't I indict your study?
You need to
like if
provide.
it's not causal, then like.
No, it's your listen. it's your burden to show us a causal link if you want us to prove
if I may, right? So,
but can I get a question, please?
Well, I was going to say that we present a causal link, and right, you don't give us any contrary evidence.
Wait, which causal
link?
Which causal link?
There's a lot of, like this study, we claim, and it controls for these factors is causal. You just claim that it's correlated.
No.
Please highlight the part of your card that says it's causal and unique to UBCs, and
it controls for multiple factors.
No, controlling for 8 factors does not equal causality. Highlight the part of your card that says it's causal and unique to UBCs, and we can talk about that then. But you don't get to just claim that it's causal without showing us that evidence.
Okay,
it's really
can
important.
I get a quick question?
Yeah.
Okay, so this is something that never really got addressed in the crossfire when David brought it up, which is about rates of gun ownership going down in the status quo. Can you explain to me how that doesn't solve all of your impacts?
2 things. Number one, this is not specific to inner cities. But second of all,
it is overall across the U.S.
Overall gun rate.
I'll tell you how inner city gun violence is proliferating. But second of all, just because gun ownership is decreasing or violence doesn't mean that you shouldn't vote affirmative and decrease it even more.
Wait, what's your link into decreasing gun ownership again?
McDonald tells you how when we have more regulations, and it studies 130 studies in 60
more
years.
regulations. Is that specific to universal background check or is that all gun control?
Is universal background check a regulation?
But some okay, let me explain. Say 90% of regulations work. Maybe that 10% of regulations doesn't work, and UBCs is definitely not 10%.
Like, it's not unreasonable for me to ask you, like, if you're going to make the analysis that UBCs uniquely reduce rates of ownership and amount of guns, and you give me all these studies, it is not unfair or unreasonable for me to ask you to show me the part of your evidence that says universal background checks uniquely caused this decrease. Like, that's not an unreasonable burden, and if you can't meet it, I don't think the judges should be voting on it.
Sure, right? We do this, right? When we're talking about prices, we tell you that overall, we increase the price of guns, which empirically increases the demand.
No, you never responded to anything about inelastic.
About inelastic demand for criminals, right? This is not like, these aren't high magnitude like criminals in these inner cities, right? These are young teens trying to buy guns.
What, you're saying there's no criminals in inner cities?
These are not like high profile criminals. Our argument
No, our argument
is we're talking about high profile criminals.
We're talking about
these aren't the criminals. These are boys with guns in inner cities. Okay. Our argument here is that guns in inner cities right now are cheaper to Texas.
And we tell you the drop of $2.5 billion in education spending analysis probably solves
that. But I think that's
25 left, I'll take it.
Okay, anyone ready? Are all the judges ready? Excellent. Are my opponents ready? As I'm after judges, I'll just be addressing the con, just going down, extending the turns and defense on their case, and then coming back to the pro, doing some weighing, telling you why the pro's winning the round. Let's begin on their NRA background check. One, they never respond to the fact that 87% of NRA members support universal background checks. Overall, that means there's not going to be any backlash, right? That means the NRA has no power to attach riders, they have no power to lobby, they have no power to alter legislation. Overall, the NRA isn't going to do anything more, but never respond to the fact that, like, the NRA does not succeed even when they spend tons of money on election, and then moreover, the NRA also wasn't responsible for the success in the election that they claim, right? They say they forced out a bunch of members of Congress. Problematically, though, the NRA supported candidates that were already going to win the elections anyways without NRA support, and they only contribute like 0.2% of the overall funding. The NRA really doesn't have power, and even if they get more money and members, that's not going to matter insofar as the way they spend the money is still not effective. Next, let's go down to like police violence. They just tell you, like we tell you directly, that gun availability and gun ownership, especially in these inner city communities, is the pretext and justification for police violence against these inner city teens and against African Americans. Overall, we see reducing gun ownership amongst these inner city teens and African Americans because they're not high-profile criminals. These are boys with guns and other people with guns who are not intent on committing crimes. They're trying to buy them for self-defense. And overall, at the end of the day, you decrease gun ownership, which means overall you're going to decrease the pretext and police justification for violence against inner city people. Next, on the pro case. So first, they will tell you that we need a gun registry. Remember the fact that states who implement UBCs don't have gun registries and they work fine. Other countries don't have registries, they work fine too. They just say that NRA loopholes are going to happen. Remember, the NRA doesn't have enough support to implement these loopholes. Next, we tell you from the Reich and Schumann evidence directly that gun violence creates a cycle of poverty and crime in these inner city communities, and if we remove the guns from that cycle, we can stop this inner city crime and violence. And they just tell you, they link into this through education spending. One, the current administration is already going to cut education spending, and two, remember, the NRA doesn't have support for, these bills. Next, remember the fact that Whitney evidence tells you directly the universal background checks are going to solve for 80% of guns used in crimes and also go down to the black market. They tell you there's going to be more trafficking. The problem is philosophy directly tells you overall 48% decreases in trafficking with states that have universal background checks. And McDonald, the best study ever conducted, overall tells you there's a decrease in gun violence and crime. Overall, they just say it's not causal. They never provide you any other evidence, no other quantification from that side. We give you the only studies in the round directly tell you we decrease violence, we overall decrease crime, gun ownership, and we solve 100,000 deaths in every 10 years.
asked them time and time again to show you one piece of evidence that says that universal background checks uniquely lead to any of the impacts they're talking about. They don't do it. That's because they can't, and that's because universal background checks have no risk of efficacy. Remember Michaels. This gets cleanly extended because they're only responses from one of these studies. But Michaels tells you very specifically that there's no risk of success without a registry. Problematically for my opponents, they drop the 3 reasons that such a registry will never occur, meaning they have no access to their impacts. What they do tell you, however, is that they make guns more expensive. There are 2 reasons you're voting for us on this alone. First is from Cook, which gets dropped until the first final focus. Don't evaluate his responses. Remember, we tell you that more expensive guns encourage criminals to get more guns, and B, motivate the illegal market to sell more guns at a higher rate, turning all their impacts against them. If you think that gun violence is bad, you vote for us there. But even more so, they tell you that rates of gun ownership are the linchpin into like all these bad things. But remember, that's going down in the status quo. You don't need to vote for them. It's solving itself. But second, remember that when prices go up, the NRA gains more powerful. This responds to all of their defense says the NRA is weak now. When they tell you they make guns more expensive, they increase profits for the NRA, making the already most powerful lobbying group in the world more powerful, triggering all of our impacts. With that in mind, let's get into riders. They say that 72% of the NRA supports it, but the NRA only supports versions of the bills that they know they can gut via riders, even more so as he tells you that these the minority are the people that are actually voting on it. Then you extend Bow cleanly throughout the round, which says that if UBCs get passed, there will be backlash. This is really important because these riders will completely gut any efficacy of the bill, making it impossible to enforce and have no effect. They say to show the materialization of this, that's what Beauchamp finds. Beauchamp finds that every time we've tried to pass gun policy, the NRA has destroyed it via these riders. But then on education, not only do these riders prevent them from winning the round, but they win us the round as well. Their only response to education spending comes in the first final focus, where it's too late for them to respond. What we tell you is that the Republicans are going to use these riders to slash education spending by $2.5 billion, turning all their framework analysis at the top of the case, and for these reasons, we're proud to negate.